Welcome to this lecture on inequality in European history from the early modern period until today. Inequality. It's a more complex concept than it may seem at first sight. It can refer to different areas of human life, and it implies the notion of equality. However, when we look back in history, the idea that all humans are or should be equals is not a given supposition. Setting equality as a norm requires the perception of humans as equal individuals. However, up to at least the 14th century, individuals were conceived as insufficient, as incomplete or imperfect, and intermediate communities were seen as essential to fulfill and protect them. Around 1500, European societies were still fragmented. They were composed of guilds, families, and religious groups, and inequality between the privileged and the non-privileged groups were not only acknowledged, but an integral part of the social system. So inequality, we could say, lay at the core of early modern European society. This system was only fundamentally challenged during the revolutions of the late 18th century. In the meantime, shifts in the anthropological conception of the individual had stressed the centrality of human agency. Natural law theories were developed and helped to imagine individuals as equals, as bearers of rights, and as the main agents of history. Violent political conflicts had contributed to discussions of the established order, and during the 18th century, literary rates had rapidly increased. All these developments led to the fundamental questioning of the old order, and during the French Revolution of 1789, for the first time in European history, equality became a grounding principle of a state constitution. And you can see a picture of this constitution, the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens, in the picture. The 19th century brought about more liberal revolutions and reforms that ended legal privileges and serfdom in some European societies and gradually opened social elites to new groups almost everywhere. And in this picture, you can see 12 points, 12 demands written up during the 1848 revolution in Hungary, and point 7 is the abolition of serfdom. So, however, despite these changes, economic inequality remained high. Both property and income were at least as unequally distributed at the end of the 19th century as they had been in its beginning. The industrialization and a perceived aggravation of the living standards of urban working classes led to a public discourse on the so-called social question. Changes in the social structures of the elites and in the legal devices that secured their privileges did not lead to a great redistribution of wealth. Wealth inequality was about 7 times higher than income inequality, and this pattern was only disrupted during the first half of the 20th century, when the 2 world wars destroyed much of the capital from which wealth is derived. So looking back on this long 19th century, we can see that social mobility was greater in the early stages of industrialization and after major socio-political changes. Despite political and cultural changes rooting in the 18th century revolutions, inequality remained high. And moreover, when we look at Europe in a global context, we see that its economic growth was based on flows from formal and informal colonies and asymmetric exchanges that covered almost all the regions of the world by 1914. One classical way to grasp and explain these wealth inequalities in the world is rooted in the Marxist tradition, whose central concept is class. According to the Marxist analysis, social classes are formed in relation to the possession of the means of production. And the political goals that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels derived from this analysis were published in their Communist Manifesto in 1848. You can see the cover of this manifesto on the picture. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, Marxist socialists aspired to a revolution that aimed to abolish capitalism and to abolish the private ownership of the means of production in order to liberate workers from the exploitation of the capitalist class. This idea was first realized in Soviet Russia, where the October Revolution in 1917 sought to establish a new economic and social system. While income inequalities radically decreased in the Soviet Union, the omnipotence of state ownership created new inequalities between ordinary people and the party cadres who controlled the means of production and also the distribution of wealth in the whole of society. In those countries where socialist experiments and workers' revolts had failed, such as Germany, Italy, or Hungary, the capitalist order was even consolidated. Authoritarian regimes were formed in many countries, and in southern and eastern Europe, where the capitalist system still preserved some of its feudal characteristics, inequality was even higher. After the Second World War and the division of Europe, income inequalities rapidly decreased in the state socialist eastern countries, and public goods such as education and healthcare were provided by the state. After the collapse of the communist regimes, however, new class inequalities formed, and private property now played a much greater role in creating social differences. So overall, economic inequalities decreased in Europe until around the 1970s, followed by an increase which is still going on. Moreover, wealth inequalities compared to income inequalities have been growing again and seem set to continue growing in the absence of a concerted attempt to tax wealth rather than income. So now we have looked at political and economic inequality over a rather long time frame, and it became visible that the developments of these inequalities are by no means linear. Moreover, changes in the concept and the lived experiences of inequality vary not only between classes, but also between the members of different social groups. So since the revolutionary search for equality in the 18th century, there have been struggles over how and to whom the concept should be applied, and significant attempts have been made to exclude different groups from the realm of the equal individuals based on concepts such as gender, race, or disability. And we will now shortly look at each of these categories. So let's start with gender. Gender inequality can be documented for the whole register of human activities from prehistoric times to the present. Many different past European cultures had constructed gender relations hierarchically, considering the masculine element not only stronger, but more strongly associated with public activities and with culture, while depicting the feminine element as private and linked to the realm of the natural. A useful example for understanding just how deeply gender inequality was entrenched in society is the family. From around 1500 to 1800, literature and other sources depicted the family as a group of unequal individuals, within which the father held a particular type of authority over his wife and also his servants and descendants. This hierarchical paternal authority was seen as an important pillar of a well-functioning state, and sometimes, for example among Puritans, also as a key to maintaining religious order. This slide you can see the drawing of an English Puritan woman drawn to show her typical clothing. The picture is from about 1640. For women, an unequal social system whose basic traits had emerged and consolidated in the Middle Ages endured well into the 19th and 20th century in many regions of Europe. As a general trend, we can see a deterioration of women's public involvement in the time between the 16th and the 18th century, and changes in the production system during the early modern age did not benefit women either. So new capitalist forms of production, including manufactures inside households, relied notably on the work of women and children, but neither of them received a separate income or recognition for such work. During the 19th century, women had less access, if any, to formal education. They earned less when they worked for a wage, and they were subordinated to men in workshops and farms. Women could not dispose of family goods without parental or marital permission, and often were discriminated by inheritance laws or customs, while their sexual behavior was also subject to a more rigid discipline. So, of course, these inequalities between men and women overlap with inequalities in social provenance and class. In early modern Europe, despite some difficulties, aristocratic women were involved in different types of informal power. Non-aristocratic women had smaller scope, and yet they still developed strategies of agency within the cracks of the system. They negotiated their access to motherhood, to remarrying, they contributed to businesses and participated in colonial exploit, and they produced cultural works from painting to literature. Their windows of opportunities widened, especially for middle-class women during the 19th century. The growth of culture and educational markets created some spaces for women writers, dramatic actresses, or singers. And state-building and nation-building projects allocated cultural and political tasks to women as the mothers of future citizens, whilst concern about the social question increased the value of motherhood and support to those who demanded education for women. Especially democratic and socialist projects held a progressive and emancipatory narrative of society that opened the path to new views on the relationship between the genders and eventually also to new social practices. To some extent, this is also true for liberal and scientific discourses, although liberalism was deeply rooted in gender differentiation. Its rise had led to new secular discourses that combined images inherited from religion with new pseudoscientific approaches to the nature of women and therefore also of men and masculinity. And civil and commercial codes, statutes, and jurisprudence translated these changes into new norms, defining roles and appropriate or inappropriate behavior in a sharper manner than it had been done in early modern Europe. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, women increasingly agitated to have the grossest sexual inequalities addressed, including voting rights, and you can see one of the many propaganda posters addressing the issue of inequality between men and women when it comes to the right to vote from the beginning of the 20th century, but also property rights and access to education and to the professions. They began to organize internationally and transnationally in their shared struggles for political, social, and economic equality. But the strength of feminism varied widely over time and space in Europe. With the overthrow of democracies by dictatorships during the interwar years, however, the newly achieved rights of citizenship could be easily withdrawn again, showing that emancipation of women follows a cyclical pattern. After the war, state propaganda of communist regimes promoted gender equality in every field. However, corresponding policies often encountered resistance based on traditional gender and family ideologies. But still, state-funded nurseries, kindergartens, and evening schools did help to socialize housework and childcare and were available to almost everyone by the late 1970s and 1980s. In the 1960s and 1970s, the sexism still embedded in radical and student politics and civil rights campaigns triggered the start of the women's liberation movement that placed a focus on politicizing the private. And it led women to seek radical and innovative ways to challenge patriarchal hegemony, not only in the state and the workplace, but also in their personal relationships and within the family. Feminism since the 1990s has then brought to the forefront issues such as intersectionality or transfeminism. Throughout these centuries, feminist achievements have always triggered discussions and attempts to limit the equality between genders. And recently, so-called men's rights activists have openly argued to return to what they call the natural order, where women are subservient to men. A deep misunderstanding of history frequently permeates these debates, with the cliché image of women, as they may have been in Victorian England, held up as an ideal. So women as homemakers, as childbearers, or as good wives. Women have, of course, long occupied a far more active place outside the home, and it is questionable to what extent this image was even true for the Victorian era. So let's come to the next social category, which is race. Next to gender, race has become one of the central categories for understanding and critiquing inequality throughout history and in the contemporary world. It was in early modern Europe that the concept of race first gained traction, but it meant something different from how we understand the concept today. Race, understood to mean major groupings within the human species based on shared physical characteristics or ancestry, or sometimes both, was a 17th century innovation. The rise of modern, racist, or racialized views of inequality, especially white supremacy, developed slowly and in complicated ways across the early modern period as European interaction with the non-European world intensified. During the first period of European expansion in the early modern period, Europeans did not generally use physical features to classify humanity, and thus whiteness, blackness, and so on did not exist as identity markers or as sociological categories. Rather, language and especially religion were the most important basis for the creation of classificatory systems. Climate theory, the idea that geography and environmental factors impact the physical and psychological character of humans, also played a role in these classificatory schemes, both within and also outside of Europe. And in this picture of Emir Berchi, both in the drawing and in the description, you can see how race was used differently in the early modern era. With the growth of slave societies throughout the so-called New World in the 17th century, and especially the 18th century, new racist views began to develop, in which blackness was identified with servility and baseness. The Atlantic revolutions in the United States and France and in Haiti were catalysts for the development of biological and often fanatical theories of fundamental inequality, especially concerning race and gender. The incorporation of equality into state constitutions, which I've mentioned earlier already, was a turning point because now foundational documents for political communities promised universal equality. So from that moment on, inequality required debate and explicit justification. The following 19th century was a period in which race was profoundly influential in shaping questions of identity and in structuring inequality. Overseas, race was used to justify the gaping inequalities of empire, meaning patterns of exploitation that included the transatlantic slave trade and the reappropriation of land across the globe. Back in the European metropolis, the language of racial differences was also used to articulate other forms of inequality, such as that based on class or ethnicity. Ideas of ethnicity were intimately bound up with questions of religion. Belonging to religious minorities entailed social discrimination and often legal barriers that banned access to certain positions in the military, in politics, and in the professional world. Another important line of division and discrimination was language. State building nearly always implied the choice of a language as the state language, and as such, it's becoming the language of the school system, of courts, of the military forces, and of political institutions, and so on. So those who did not master the state language faced a strong barrier in their relationships with civil servants and also a real obstacle to climb the social ladder. And on this map, you can see the diffusion of language groups at the start of the 20th century in Europe. In the 20th century, the discrimination of ethnic minorities played a key role in the nation-building processes after the First World War. There were big differences in the social and cultural conditions of these minorities and in the way that they were dealt with by legislation and by social norms, but discrimination existed everywhere. One group that was especially that experienced racial discrimination in Europe throughout the centuries were Jewish people. The first example of thinking in terms of heritable and therefore racial inequalities in the post-classical world developed on the Iberian Peninsula in the 14th and 15th century as a background to various discriminatory laws enacted against Jewish people. In the 19th century, Jewish migration across Europe increased partly due to pogroms and other anti-Semitic violence in Russia, and within this time frame, anti-Semitism became increasingly laden with ideas about racial as well as religious differences, as demonstrated, for example, in anti-Semitic cartoons and caricatures, which increasingly depicted Jewish people as being ethnically different. And then the National Socialist regime first segregated Jewish people, then ghettoized them, and finally attempted their extermination in all areas it controlled. The Shoah was followed by a large immigration to the State of Israel, established in 1948, and now open discrimination of Jewish citizens tended to disappear in post-war Europe, although anti-Semitism did not. And it was even translated sometimes, and in certain countries, into measures that implied a discriminatory treatment of those considered to be Jews. Another group that experienced immense discrimination are Romani people. You can see on this picture called Bouncing Game on the southern border of the Netherlands, the depiction of policies towards Roma and Sinti people in the Netherlands and in Belgium in the 1880s. With the rise of liberalism, industriousness, honest ways of earning a living, and other new socio-political understandings of what was proper or improper, effectively criminalized their activities. The nomadic way of life of many Roma and Sinti people excluded them from the political rights at all levels, even after the introduction of universal male suffrage, because those rights were associated with a permanent residence. Roma and Sinti people were also isolated by the Nazis and then subjugated to measures aiming at their extermination in what is nowadays called Paramus. Their position in most European countries did not improve after the war to the point that their suffering under the Nazi regime was not even made visible or recognized. Later, Fordist capitalism and also communism gradually closed many spaces in which Roma and Sinti people had previously lived and operated, whilst varying combinations of social policies and repression tried to force them to abandon their ways of life. A new dimension of inequality took off in Europe during the 1950s and 60s. The demand for labor in the fastest growing economies of northwestern Europe fostered a south-north migration. Once arrived, immigrants oftentimes performed the lowest paid jobs and very often did not have easy access to citizenship, a condition that was coupled with social prejudices against poor foreigners. However, collective discrimination was, and still is, more active when immigrants did not come from Christian countries and when they had external traits, such as color of hair, that can be turned into the basis of their racialization. For this reason, the last wave of immigration that started in the 1990s, with many immigrants coming from old European colonial empires, has fostered a widespread rise in xenophobic attitudes, reflected in the rise of ultra-right political parties. So let's come to the last social category I'm going to talk about, which is disability. Although not part of the commonly repeated trinity of class, gender, and race, typically seen as the dominant categories for analyzing inequality, disability and health were and are also important lines along which privilege and discrimination are drawn. And I will shortly say a few words about the discrimination of disabled people in Europe now. Rapid industrialization throughout the 19th century created disability on a large scale due to the unsafe working conditions found in factories, mills, and mines, and the cramped living conditions that followed intense patterns of urbanization also generated disability by facilitating the spread of disease and other life-changing conditions. However, disability was of course not limited to a particular class. Both congenital and acquired disabilities were found across boundaries of class and economic well-being and thus constitute an axis of inequality in its own right. In this picture, you see a Christmas entertainment presented in sign language. This happened in 1865. It was organized by the Association of the Deaf and Dumb. And this is an example of the growth of educational programs for deaf and blind people in the 19th century. In the same time, also institutionalization of disabled people increased for different reasons. The quality of life in such institutions varied enormously and was also shaped by class and economic well-being. Some of these institutions were highly abusive, whilst others provided a more well-intentioned, if in many ways deficient, standard of living. Gender too heavily inflicted the experience of life in these institutions, with female inmates often enlisted to help with the domestic running of the institution, while male inmates were instructed in other forms of early occupational therapy, such as woodwork. During the 20th century, institutionalization became more centralized and treatments also became more homogenized. While this led to the improvement of medical and psychiatric care, it also resulted in new biopolitical measures that implied total or partial confinement. Eugenic measures were brought to an extreme under the National Socialist regime, and even after this, countries such as Norway or Sweden maintained norms of the interwar period to legalize eugenic sterilizations. It was only in the 1980s that a new social sensitivity towards people with disabilities started to emerge. Eugenic policies started to disappear and integration became the general social aim, with confinement then starting to be seen as an extreme solution. The result of the new views in disabilities were curtailed, however, by the stagnation or deconstruction of welfare institutions and policies that have characterized the evolution of most European countries since the 1980s. So to conclude, we can see that inequality and also equality as concept and as lived experiences have changed and shifted throughout the centuries. Inequalities are constructed and lived along different and intersecting social categories. So thank you for your attention.